tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. We're your hosts this evening. I'm Tobias, and this is Will. Together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you.
As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you are all now members, provided you adhere to our philosophy, ex curiositas, scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is nothing. We admit that it is impossible to know everything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. And now let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Jeff Shay and Rebecca Gilbert of CC Stern Typecasting.
We're dedicated to preserving the art and industry of the cast letter form. Our facility contains what we call the Museum of Metal Typography. If any of you looked at our website, you see that right away come up at the top, on the top banner there. And that's an assortment of equipment and tools which are used to make metal type, used specifically for letterpress printing. And this includes hand casting, and that's the part that Jeff's going to demonstrate towards the end of this presentation. Mechanized sorts and line casting. Hopefully some of that will become more clear as we show you some photos. And also composition casting, so for longer pieces of writing. Our original collection belonged to Chris Stern of Stern & Bay Printers, and they were located in Cedar Woolley, Washington. He and his wife Jules used the machines and the matrices that we now own to cast type for their letterpress books and broadsides and art prints. And their business still exists. Chris passed away a little bit prematurely in his life, and that's part of the reason why we took on the Foundry, was to try to keep his legacy alive and to be able to create those kind of things, and also to connect with more of the industry of typecasting, and we were all kind of interested in that portion of our history. So, contemporary letterpress printing often uses digitally produced plates or type forms as opposed to handset type. And but for hundreds and hundreds of years, of course, starting with Gutenberg, hand cast metal type was the way that it was the technology that dictated the way that information was disseminated or that print was done. So the machines in our collection are in various states of restoration. The majority of them are operational, and visitors to our facility can see type being made utilizing the different methods. You know, there are at least 2 people in this audience who've been in the last month and they've gotten an overview of those casting methods and been fascinated by the amount of information that was disseminated. So, in addition to the working museum, our programming includes informal presentations from different printers working with metal type. They come into the Foundry, give a little talk about their work, show some examples, and open it up to questions. Occasionally we have film screenings related to printing or typecasting. We host lectures or field trips for school groups at mostly at the university level. We've had some younger kids come through too, but primarily school groups from design or journalism programs. We do an oral history project, which documents the stories of area typecasters and printers who worked in the industry. And we also do outreach at print and design related events and conferences. So we don't have enough time tonight to give you a complete overview of each of the machines, but Jeff is going to talk about a few of the basic components of typecasting and typecasting machines and show you some photos and then do the demonstration. So.
actually, I'm going to reverse it a little bit from what Rebecca said because, you can tell we've done this a lot. No. You're entering into the world of jargon and all kinds of specialized information. And we've been doing this for various lengths of time, all of us, and we're still novices as well. So I'm going to show you how type was made because it gives you sort of a beginning foundation to understand what all of the rest of these very complex machines do. So I have here a pot of molten type metal. You can't see in it, but it's there. So the process for making type is actually, it's pretty straightforward, but it's very, very detail-oriented and very, very picky. You got to remember that presses all run at a certain height, and so the type has to be that high or it doesn't run correctly on the presses. So you have to have precision, even if you're just doing hand casting like I'll be doing tonight. So after the type is designed, we won't even talk about designing type. That's a whole different world. But once the type is designed, it goes to the people who are called punch cutters. And you'll be welcome to come up and look at this more closely after the talk. But what this is it looks like a piece of type almost. It looks like something you could print with, except that it's made out of steel, made by hand, and then carefully filed, or back in the day of Gutenberg, it was probably done with gravers and chisels to create this. And so this is actually a punch, a metal punch, like you would find, I don't know, if you had a set of letter stamps that you punched on a piece of copper or something. This punch is then used to punch into what's called a matrix. You'll hear me say matrix a lot, or MAT, it's abbreviated. So basically, it creates a little cavity in this piece of copper. That matrix is then very carefully squared up. Make sure that the face of it is the correct depth, because this goes then into this thing which is called a hand mold. So this is a two-part device. Looks like this. The matrix actually fits in the bottom here, assuming that I don't drop it. There we go. It's held on by this big spring. So what the hand mold allows you to do is then to cast a piece of type. So you can't see this very well from here. I forgot my big pieces of type, but the very top of the type that actually prints is what the matrix makes. The mold itself makes what's called the body of the type, which is this whole long piece here. Once the type is cast, then the jet itself is broken off and the type is dressed, and then it's ready to print with. So there's a lot of discussion about, historical discussion about exactly what Gutenberg invented and so forth, but there's a fair amount of, I won't say certainty, but a lot of it is around the fact that Gutenberg probably figured out major parts of how to do this process. So my pot of molten type metal, it's not really nachos. Yeah, cute little ladle. Pour it in there. Pull the spring.
Theoretically, there's a piece of type.
And there you go, a piece of type, just like that. Now, here's the thing that will make your head hurt. This is the way type was cast up until 1840 or so. All type was cast this way, by hand. So you can imagine there was an enormous impetus to figure out other ways to do it. In about 1840, the manufacturers or inventors came up with a way to mechanize typecasting, but you still ended up with something very similar to this that had to be hand-fitted, hand-dressed to be ready for printing. And you were still then hand-assembling all the type together into a page to print whatever you wanted to print. One letter at a time, one space at a time, lines of leading in between. It's called the spacing, line spacing. So you can imagine it was a laborious process to print anything. Well, we're in the mid-1800s, 1840, 1850, 1860, more and more people are reading, more and more things are being published. You've got newspapers cropping up, you've got that kind of thing. Literacy is increasing all across at least the Western world. And so if you can think about the concept of trying to publish, let's say, a daily newspaper using handset type, every edition would have to be changed, or something like a dictionary with handset type. You know, the process of actually assembling a dictionary. I've got an 1848 copy of Webster's Dictionary that had to have been handset. And it's probably got 200 different characters in it, because you think about all those little accent characters, all the pronunciation characters, all of that stuff was a different individual letter, where you had to actually cut punches, do mats, and then somebody had to hand cast the type. You put it in a big case, it's called, with little pockets for all of the individual pieces of type. Somebody stands there, sets it, you proof it, make sure it's right. Somebody then puts the type back in the case after you've used it, because it was expensive. It was all made by hand, one piece at a time. So you had to have a very skilled workforce working in a print shop doing that kind of thing. Not cheap. And so that's where, let's see if this technology will help me now.
Jay, could you pass that around?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's just pass that bit around. And you can come up afterwards and see these up close, and if you want, I'll cast some more afterwards. So you can imagine it's, say, 1880, 1885. You're in New York. You've got the Hearsts and the Pulitzers competing to bring out newspapers as fast as they possibly can, and they're all handset. You've got huge rooms full of compositors, they're called, sitting there hand-setting type. Somebody's distributing that type. And the competition between the papers is fierce. So, for a variety of reasons, but a big one was the newspaper trade. There was a great impetus to figure out how to mechanize typesetting. So, the very first successful mechanized, economically successful, not physically successful, but economically successful, hand typesetting machine, or mechanical typesetting machine was the Linotype. 1889. It's got about 3,000 moving parts in it, all working together mechanically. And it was financed by a bunch of newspaper publishers because they wanted to be able to set the newspaper fast and at less cost. So the Linotype has this funny-looking keyboard. It's not like our standard keyboards set out in usage. So I don't know if you can see this first line here is by usage. So it's lowercase e, lowercase t, I, O, N, and so on across the keyboard. And an operator would sit there, type at the keyboard, the mats, a different version, but basically the same idea of the mat that was originally, that I was using here, gets assembled. They put together like this. These bands are actually called space bands. That's what allowed them to actually make the column width correctly. You can see they're tapered, very thin at the top, thicker at the bottom. When the line is cast, these get moved up to expand the line out. And so the spacing is just very mechanical, very straightforward. It also gives rise to those things you might have seen in old newspapers where you'll see two long words with a big space in the middle. Well, it's because the spacing is not all that sophisticated. The machine just pushes the space bands up until the line width is filled out, and you're done. So the Linotype was really intended to excel at setting newspaper copy. Lots and lots of lines of type really fast. The first ones only had 72 characters available. So basically upper and lowercase, and that was about it. Later ones expanded into 90, and then finally 180 characters, but you still think about an alphabet, that's a pretty limited amount by the time you bring into it uppercase, lowercase, numbers, punctuation, all that stuff. So at the same time, you know, the limitations of the Linotype device were pretty well known. It was a purpose-built device. Excuse me. The same, excuse me. Concurrently, there was another inventor by the name of Gilbert who was working on a much more sophisticated mechanical typesetting system, and that's the Monotype system. And we have both of these machines up and running at the Foundry. So depending on the day, you can come and see them actually making type. The Monotype system is a two-part system. You've got the keyboard here, where this Natalie dressed gentleman is sitting with a horrible posture. And then you've got the caster over here. Typically, they were in fact completely separate operators, completely separate rooms. We actually have a photograph of the general printing office that has like 125 of these keyboards in one room. And then they had about the equal number of casters in a completely separate room. This machine makes my head hurt, and I understand it. So this is the layout of the keyboard. And you'll see here, if you look closely, you'll see we've got our standard, what we're used to, QWERTY keyboard, repeated again and again. There's actually 5 of them in there. There's upper and lowercase Roman, upper and lowercase italic, and small cap. And then you've got all the specials. You've got ligatures, upper and lowercase ligatures, here and here. You've got, of course, numbers, fractions, punctuation, all of that stuff, all on this one big keyboard. The keyboard then actually punches a paper tape. Looks like a player piano type, almost. It's not quite as wide, it's only about that wide. And it gets fed into the caster. In the caster, here's that word again, mats. This is a mat case that's in the caster, and that tape controls the motion of this mat case within the caster. So if you need this letter, this mat case moves into position, the type is cast, and then it lifts up and moves into a different position for the next letter, a different position for the next letter. All at, what, how fast, Chris?
140 characters.
About 140 characters a minute. And so a linotype, as the name sort of implies, creates a line of type. So it actually is on a slug that looks like this. So if the operator has made a mistake, you recast that entire line. It makes some other parts of the process easier because easier to handle than assembling a bunch of individual letters, of course. But it also creates problems with corrections and the spacing problems that we were talking about earlier. The Monotype actually creates individual pieces of loose type, just like handcast type, in order, basically ready to be printed from. So the corrections are easier, and it's a much more sophisticated device in terms of line spacing, or word spacing, letter spacing. So, whereas the Linotype basically was using just that mechanical wedge to space out the words. In the Monotype, the machine actually calculates the amount of space needed between each word for each line, and it will then space things accordingly. So you've got a much more sophisticated, even color between the words. So those are probably our two big deal machines at the Foundry. They're all fun though. Excuse me. This is another type of Monotype machine. This is the one we get.
Maybe I missed it, but how does the information get from the keyboard to the Monotype machine?
On the paper tape.
Oh, just by walking it over?
Yeah, just by walking it over. Sneaker net. The thing that's really trippy about the paper tape, though, is you really can't read it. You can clumsy your way through it, and probably a really good operator could, because it's just a series of holes. All those holes are doing is controlling pneumatically the motion of that mat case. And so your operator better know what he's doing, and you better have the whole system set up correctly, or you get basically gibberish out the other end on the casting machine. So, no, go ahead. Yeah, ask questions freely.
So the paper just basically like blocks off paths for air pressure,
Right.
and then allows certain things that when those holes are pressurized, that they go on over here.
Right, exactly.
Oh,
So
cool.
basically, it's basically controlling the X-Y motion of that mat case through pneumatics.
Awesome.
So,
And then what is it doing? It's punching into the copper, or it's actually?
no, it's actually casting what it's doing. So that case of matrices, this is where my PowerPoint skills, there we go. Oh, I did it. So So this is, each one of these little matrices in here is exactly the same idea as this one I showed here. On the Linotype machine, the mold is part of the machine. And so what happens is this is moving around X, Y, putting the right character for the, the next letter over the mold. The cast is made and then it moves again. And it's also adjusting the width of the mold, but that's more than enough to make everybody's head hurt. Yeah?
So how were these machines developed? Like were they part of, like did a large company develop these with like from a newspaper or?
The Monotype machine was more or less an individual deciding to figure out how to do it. He got investors, and over time, he also, it went through the kind of development that's common then, where somebody will come up in the ranks and ends up being actually a better inventor than the guy who came up with it originally, and so it's always a really sort of clumsy, small process, or oftentimes was, but pretty much there was no specific money behind Lanston when he invented this, as opposed to Mergenthaler, who invented the Linotype, who did have this group of newspaper publishers behind it. I think partially it's just the amount of money in the trades that would use this machine. So this machine you would find in more sophisticated publishing operations, so book houses. It was used a lot for railroad timetables and that kind of thing, because you can do columns of figures that align correctly much easier with this than you can with the Linotype. Advertising typography to a certain extent. Anything where you wanted the type matter to be more sophisticated and spaced, or it had a lot of extra characters. So if you imagine something like a math textbook, for instance, where you've got a bazillion different characters that you need to actually set it. So this mat case will hold 225 characters. Some of them have to be spaces, but that's way more than the 90 out of the Linotype, so you've got a lot more versatility. And you could swap these out. So if you were, for instance, a math book textbook publisher, you might have a case that you designed specifically that had all of those square roots and cube roots and all of that stuff in there, because that's what you did for a living.
Sorry.
No.
Did this ever evolve into anything, or was it specifically used in some kind of thing that was more like a drafting form, like where they had one unbroken line that just continually moved? I guess you couldn't, because it was casting.
It's casting,
Okay,
right.
never
Everything
mind.
is casting,
Sorry.
yeah. So one of our other machines at the Foundry is the sorts caster. A little printing trivia aside. The printing term for a single letter of a single size of the type style, so say a 16-point lowercase Bodoni A, the printing term for that is a sort. And you can imagine that becomes an issue. When you have loose type, you've got a big case of type. Type gets dropped, it gets damaged. And it's in there in proportion to its usage as well. So when you buy a font of type from a Foundry, you get a whole lot of lowercase e's and a few uppercase z's. So if you drop two z's because of some weird thing, then all of a sudden they have short of z's. So you could call up the Foundry and buy your uppercase z's. Well, that would be called ordering some sorts, and if you were setting a page of type and you ran out of one letter, it's referred to as being out of sorts, which is where that phrase comes from. This is a sorts caster. It just casts one letter at a time. It looks a lot like the Monotype, the composition caster, the system caster, because most of the parts are the same. It's just simplified a bit. We have one of these. This is the first machine we got going at the Foundry, and this uses a completely different kind of mat. That mat looks a lot more like this one, where it's just a smaller, thin piece of brass, but it's again the same idea. The mat is casting the printing surface of the letter, and then the mold, which stays on the machine, prints or creates the body of the letter. This is another kind of sorts caster. We have one of these that dates from 1914. It's our oldest, sort of biggest project machine that's slowly coming back to life. There was a lot of innovation during this time. Everybody was trying to come up with a better mousetrap. This machine is interesting because it was originally created to use linotype mats. So, and it predates, well, it doesn't predate the monotype, but as the sorts caster, it was one of the earliest ones, partially because the linotype mats were the only thing that were available. Nobody else was mass producing mats. Partially because if you're running a linotype shop, it sure would be nice to have a case of matching type in case you had to rush a line together or something. It's a little hard for us to imagine at this point the size of the printing industry when this equipment was all being made. I had somebody at the Foundry one time ask me, so what did they print? Well, the answer is everything. You know, you didn't just sit down and put together your letterhead and hit the laser printer with it. You didn't get the RV pre-cut business cards. You're a business person, you know, you went down to the local printer and you got your business cards and your invoices and everything. So the industry, at one point, printing was the fourth largest industry in the United States. And it's sort of the heyday of this equipment. This particular thing is a fairly rare machine that we have that actually makes the spacing that goes in between the lines of type. So, makes big long strips of material. This is another actually line caster, but in this case it's a hybrid machine where you actually hand assemble the mats together and then cast a line of type. Its role in the world of printing of this era is it can cast very large type and it's very flexible because you're doing the spacing by hand. It was used primarily for headlines and for captioning in newspapers. And then we've also branched out a little bit into the world of stuff that actually is the step before making type, which is making matrices. There's several different ways to make matrices. Punch is one of them, and it's the oldest way. You can also route matrices out. You can actually take a piece of metal and create the cavity with a router. That's what this machine would do. You'd have a large pattern up on this table that through this set of arms that's really kind of garbled looking in this picture, but runs a router bit down here basically, or a cutter bit, that then will make the matrices. So there was all of these steps involved in going from that sketch on the back of the envelope to turning it into an actual piece of type that you could print from.
Does that, so when you say a large thing that like reduces it
Right.
to mechanical
Right.
means or whatever, and makes it really small?
Basically, you've got a set of scissor arms like this that reduces the motion of the stylus up here by a set amount that you can set to a smaller amount of motion down here.
So you can dial it in and be like, I want this giant A to be this big, or
No,
something
yeah,
like that.
Essentially, yeah, exactly. Couple of things. Most type designers worked at about 4 inches or so on their patterns, and you could. Is the Benton? Hey Chris, is the Benton pantograph capable of going from 4 all the way down to like 10 point in one step, or did they do 2?
You didn't do, what the Benton just did a single reduction,
Single reduction.
but that's because it was like a mesh machine.
Yeah,
You don't have, so.
yeah. The one that was used in the type business specifically, this one was not, is a crazy machine. And it will reduce all the way from, 4-point pattern down to, or excuse me, a 4-inch pattern down to 10-point type in one step.
Give me like
A 10, okay, yeah, it would be, okay, so 4-inch is 288. So basically, from 288 units to 10 units.
oh wow,
Yeah.
that's awesome. That's really precise.
We think in points in this world because everything was designed in points, and a point is a 72nd of an inch, almost.
Okay.
That's another long story. Yeah.
Is the mat always going to be brass or copper or soft metal?
Yes, brass, copper, aluminum. Mats were made of aluminum, and they were made of tin too, I think, weren't they? But yeah, it's always going to be something that's fairly soft. The type metal itself is relatively low temperature. It's in the 650 degree range, so you don't need to get more crazy than that. Although they did, on some larger mats, they did in fact nickel plate them to make them harder and to increase their longevity. So that's kind of a run through of the big heavy toys that we have and what they do. And now everybody needs to come this Saturday and see some of them working. So, questions? It's a huge bunch of information, I realize.
So if you were gonna use that router to
Mhm.
route out from that, you would be doing pretty large type code.
We would have to do, that particular one, we would have to do several steps to get down to smaller type. And we would be intending to make the matrices actually. So we would make the matrix and then it would go in the casting machine and we use the machines to cast the type.
But it couldn't get down to like that one that you did just now?
It can, it would take several steps.
Oh,
You can do it sequentially, so, you know, go 4" to say 2" and then 2" to 1/2". The downside of that is it leaves a lot of room for error and ability to sort of lose detail. So ideally you don't do that, but this was the right machine at the right price and most importantly in the right location, which is what made it the right machine.
Well, that machine in specific was used a lot for, you know, you see those old office signs where someone's name is on a little piece of plastic next to the door or on their desk with their name. It was made to kind of do that kind of engraving of letter forms, but we're gonna adapt it to our use. Bend its will.
That's right. Yeah.
So, do you guys ever, have you guys tried to tackle your own, like, typography, your own
Type designs.
alphabet?
Alphabet, yeah. We talk about it.
So as of yet, at the Foundry, we're really trying to get all the machines operational again. So the part of them that belong to Chris Stern, 2 of them were ones that he used a lot, and others were in his Foundry, but he rarely used or never used. So our first goal was to get them all operational, and then to expand the collection so we have the complete story of how type was made, and then to start making our own. You know, so using those matrices that we already have, that, you know, we have, there's no photos of them there, but if you come on Saturday, you'll see we have shelves and shelves and all sorts of cool little storage units filled with matrices that already exist, that have been engraved, that are historic, you know, and it's great to cast those. But at some point, yeah, we'd love to move in to tell that story of how you can then make your own typeface. And we keep motioning to Chris, who's taking a photo right now, but we'll make him stand up so.
Yeah.
That's Chris Chen back there, and he is part of the CC Stern Type Foundry as well, and he has been involved in both engraving and casting a unique type design, which will, of course, we'll rely on that skill as we start to do that ourselves.
So are you producing and selling type now, or are you mostly just working on getting machines going?
We are producing type, we are not selling type, and getting the machines going. We do, I guess that's a technicality, like we have trinkets, kind of ornaments you can take with you, souvenirs you can take with you from the Foundry, but we're not producing for hire. We're all volunteer run, as I said before, we all have day jobs, and there are wonderful type foundries that already exist in this country and in other countries that you can order type from.
So
And
that's
we
not your primary goal.
That's not our primary goal. Our primary goal is education, preservation, and inspiration.
And we know most of those other people are making type and they're friends, and so we want them to stay in business.
Yeah, and then we're happy to steer you towards them. If you're looking for new type, we're happy to give you names of people and places you can get it from. Yeah, but it's fun to see it being made still.
Well, I was gonna say, as a money raiser, but you pulled the rug out from underneath that by saying they're all friends, we want them to stay in business.
Yeah.
If you sold type.
Yeah.
We are thinking of possibly selling things out of the strip material maker because we have the matrices to make fancy borders, which a number of those, and most people printing today have never even seen that material, let alone had the opportunity to use it. It's by its nature, it gets shorter and shorter and shorter every time you do something with it, and then all of a sudden it's just scrap. So we are slowly working on that machine, trying to get it back up and running if we can figure out a recalcitrant bearing in it. So.
Do you know anything about like the manufacturer of like typewriter hammers, like the little, like the typewriter type?
Well, I don't, although just because I've been involved in a lot of making of stuff over the years, they are almost certainly have to be some sort of die casting, which is generically what this is as well, is a form of die casting. There's a lot of different forms, and you can do it with steel, or I don't know if they're steel or not, but I suspect they are. So they would have to be done like that. They could also have been punched. It's kind of amazing how with hydraulic punch presses you can make that kind of form and then sent to be hardened so that they can hold up to the kind of use they're getting.
So when you have like a specific font set, is it, and you've casted the set, and or you start with the
Matrices?
Yeah, the matrices. Thank you. And so do those come? Do you typically have a number of sizes, or do you have like a limited amount that you have to like size down?
Well, the tradition in this era of printing was not having half point sizes like we do now. It was typically, let's see if I can get this even. Rebecca, I answer this one. 6, 8, 12.
6, 8, 10, 12, sometimes 14, 18, every once in a while 16, 24, 30, 36, 48, 72.
Yeah.
Sometimes a 16.
So basically,
In France.
And one.
yeah.
Yeah, right.
Indigo.
This is, only in certain, in our measurement standards. So we get into all the different measurements in different countries and different type sizes and heights, and forget it.
Yeah.
And then when I have the like Dan Solo books of collections of his type, and they would do distortion, and I always wondered how they would do the letter distortion. Do you know how they did that?
Well, basically the optical scaling, it's called, was required for two reasons. Partially, it was just the process of putting ink on paper. When you put a small piece of type print a small piece of type, the spaces in the type, so like the triangular space in the A, which is referred to as a counter, tends to want to fill in because there's a little bit of spread when you hit the paper.
Right.
And then also optically the same thing happens in small sizes. So basically the interesting exercise, you can find this on the web, is that say you take a 72 point, a 1 inch capital A, and you reduce it down to 10 point, which is 10/72 of an inch. It will not look the same, and vice versa, because of the optical scaling. The Benton pantograph that was, the King machine, took that into account once you knew how to operate it, so you could still use the same pattern. And then typically they would aim for about 3 different sizes, somewhere around 10 point, and then 18, and then somewhere around, I want to say 48. If I remember correctly, I might be a little off on that. But so basically, in those ranges, the design would be the same, but it would be adjusted given the sizing.
Rebecca mentioned different countries have different systems. I presume ours is based on the English system. which would mean that printing in India would be the same as printing in America and in South Africa.
Sure.
But if we try to go to France, we have a problem. You can't sell type to France.
No, especially because our type would be short in France.
It's easier if France sells us
Yeah.
type because we can shave off the bottom of the type.
Right. The other problem with
Cut them down to size. It's
Yeah.
French.
Right.
Yeah.
right, the other problem with French type is it uses a different sizing system. So they use a system called Dito rather than point sizes, and so if you imagine a page of typeset matter, there's all the stuff that you see, but there's all of the stuff that you don't see that holds all of the stuff that you see together. So all of the leading and all of the spacing and all of that, because if you imagine in a letterpress, most letterpresses, all of the type is locked up in a square frame called a chase. Well, there's nothing on the back side of that chase. And you've got all of these little tiny pieces of metal that you have to keep locked together firmly to be able to pick it up off of the stone, it's called, put it in the press and all of that. And you really don't want it falling apart when it's in the press. That's a very bad thing. And so you've got all the spacing that has to be to the same height, to the same standard. You've got all of that stuff that has to be the same squareness as well, because basically it's like sitting out of, 24 kids blocks and grabbing them like this to pick them all up at once. So you have to make sure all of your stuff is running on the same set of rules.
What is your, what is the material that you cast with, the actual typeset itself?
It's an alloy of lead, antimony, and tin. It varies a little bit depending on which machine it's running in. The antimony provides hardness, the tin provides flowability, and the lead is basically just filler. Yeah, basically it's kind of like, you can think of the type metal as basically as a solution. So if you're thinking, say, a water, sugar, and ethyl alcohol solution, the water is the lead, the antimony is the sugar, and the ethyl alcohol provides the flowability, so that would be the tin.
Does that help? Just as abstract.
Is there, because you've got the matrices, so you can recast, seems like fairly easily something, but is the, in the industry where they just like, you know what, we'll make X amount of sets of the same letters if we've got to do a really long run, or did they ever say, you know what, we should make something with harder material? Or was it kind of more like industry standard, they're like, no, we'll just keep remaking it?
We're only showing you one part of the industry, but this part of the industry was made for money, basically, for running information, for printing things that were
Constantly
coming
changing.
and going. Yeah, constantly changing in transition. And there's a whole other method of typecasting, which we refer to as true Foundry type, which is a little bit harder alloy and was made for print shops that were hand setting to have for years and years and years. It was your upgrade, if you weren't buying this kind of composition, which most shops weren't, they wanted to compose their own work in shop, they would buy Foundry type. So is that kind of,
Yeah, and you gotta remember, this equipment was really intended or designed for, as Rebecca said, high volume print shops that had a lot of changes, a lot of volume. The machines were not cheap. It was amazing how many print shops had them given their price, but so, you wanted to be running a newspaper, you wanted to be a really successful village print shop or someplace like that before you would invest in this kind of equipment. And of course, the commensurate costs in your local job printer are not as high either, because, setting a business card for somebody and then redistributing the type is a much different problem than setting an 8-page newspaper and redistributing the type. So the other thing about longevity is that there's another process that was used in big printing, newspaper printing plants and book printing plants called stereotyping, where they would actually set the type and then take a mold off of it and actually cast a plate,
Okay.
which is the way.
That plate was a curved plate that been on large web presses, like you
So
probably,
you can roll.
yeah,
Right.
you kind of probably all went on a field trip at some point where you went to a huge printing office and you saw these big,
Huge rolls of paper and everything, so that was also a very common, common process as well. I slept. Hopefully you haven't slept too.
With like a Linotype machine where you're getting like these lines of type where it's all like something you can only use once, or like say one printing of a newspaper, can you just toss those like pieces back in the machine and it will just automatically melt them back down?
Absolutely. In bigger plants, they would have what was called a remelt, and in fact, in a bigger plant, what you would do is you would cast all of the leading, all of the spacing, the lines, everything would be all out of the same alloy, and so you wouldn't have to sort through the forms or do anything. It would all just get dumped into what was called the hell box, and then some poor schmo in the basement would feed them into the remelt and cast. These machines are fed by what are called pigs, so they're 22.5-pound chunks of metal about this long and about that big around, and they would be recast into those and just reused. Occasionally they had to add some metal to adjust the composition, but you can reuse it a lot.
If you went through an apprenticeship in the 1960s, 50s, often your first job would be running the smelter, the remelt, for 6 months. Yeah.
And then you directly go to being unemployed.
Then,
Going back to college.
right.
Yeah, realizing that I don't want to be a printer.
You get promoted to sorting the metal to go into the remelt. Or cleaning the molds was another common thing, just making sure they're nice and clean.
Do you guys ever, like, is there any kind of like weird, like, I don't know, did somebody at the New York Times when they went digital or something, that where they like, this is the hell box that we've used for the last 150 years, and all of this metal in this box has been used to print every newspaper for that. I mean, is there any kind of weird reference or any weird stories where you guys are like, oh, we went and found this machine at this place?
Well, the best story that we have is that Thompson Typecaster, which was one of the last machines that Jeff showed that he said has the most restoration to do, and that's rumored to belong to Mr. Thompson, who was the inventor of that particular machine. It's serial number 120, so we have that kind of reverence for that machine. We don't know if that story's true, but no one can prove it false. And all paths lead to that story, so we're going with it.
Printers were a very unsentimental lot, which makes some of this equipment very, very hard to find. On the other side of it, they're also lazy, so you often find a piece of equipment that's shoved back in a corner behind about 8,000 pounds of other stuff, because it was just too much work to figure out how to get rid of it. So it kind of works both ways.
I have a story to add to that too, actually. Just 3 weeks ago, one of the printers who's involved in this oral history project, we've been interviewing different people. I haven't interviewed him yet, but he came by my commercial shop to drop off some things for the Foundry. And among those were his personal composings. He became an intern in 1964 or something like that. An apprentice, I'm sorry, in the printing business, and ended up owning a pretty big print shop here in Portland. So he brought back by his personal composing stick for setting type. He brought by all these rulers that he'd had and different measuring devices, all the press from when he had bought the company that he was an owner of, and all the what were called junior typo news, which were published monthly by the apprentices, printing apprentices in Portland. So every month an apprentice from a different shop would be the editor of this newsletter, and they would cast or set the type for it and distribute it to all the other apprentices who were part of the Multnomah Typographic Union. And they were all little binders, and he was like, I don't know who else will use these. So that's one of those highly sentimental things. I've been reading them for bedtime reading.
Oh, wow.
They're awesome. There was a misprinting week, which might have to nominate you with your costumes at some point. Maybe Union was actually worldwide, and it was super strong union. And the Multnomah Typographic Union was part of that. But, you know, just like unions in every other, you know, industry, pretty much, that's dissolved, and the Graphic Arts Union, or whatever the union is now, is totally useless.
Used to be that if you had your journeyman card as a printer from the ITU, you could basically walk into any shop and say, I want a job. And if they had one, they had to give it to you. We know a guy who was probably one of the last of the tramp printers who worked in 92 different shops all over the world. He basically traveled all through the United States and all through Australia based on his ITU card. He could walk into a shop and say, I need some work. He'd work there for a week and then move on. He was unusual too in that he knew how to both run press and set type, so he had both things going for him. But that was the kind of power that the union had at that point.
I guess if there aren't any other immediate questions, I would really encourage you to come up here and to handle some of these pieces and to tell Jeff.
And then wash your hands.
Please, can you pass some more? Yeah, and then wash your hands before you put the chips in your mouth, because there is lead in that alloy.
Although it is safe if it's
yeah.
when it's metallic, so.
Yeah.
You guys were on your open house. Do you have a schedule of events, or is it just kind of your speakers, or
No,
what does the day look like?
We are set up as a working museum, which means we're there working on projects. And when you come by, we'll take you on a little tour through the machines. Usually we take turns talking about whichever machine we're working on. Someone will usually talk you through some of the basics again, like look at the different kinds of matrices and molds and that kind of thing. So stop by whenever. We're going to try to have hourly demonstrations using the hand mold casting, but you don't need to see that because you've seen it here tonight. And we don't know when hourly is. It could be half hour or on the hour. We don't know.
could be like 32 minutes after.
32 minutes after.
Thank you.
So definitely encourage everyone to come up and ask more questions and check out the molten lead. I was sitting in the front seat so I could see. It's cool. So I just real quick, I want to tell you about the next Curiosity Club, which is November 26th with Eric Isaacson and A Brief History of Mississippi Records. This is a talk about the impossibly bad business model that is Mississippi Records. He'll be speaking about how Mississippi has managed to sustain as a lo-fi business for over 10 years. Mississippi Records has run a label and retail store with the only technology at play being a calculator and a notebook and no promotion or advertising of any kind. Despite these limitations, they've managed to release over 172 records and run a modestly successful record store. Eric will also discuss some of the great artists they've been honored to work with who share their low-to-the-ground approach, their worldwide strange as hell distribution system, and other aspects of the business. So, should be really good. Let's have another round of applause for I'm sure you all saw the flyers on your chair, but you should definitely go check out the open house on this Saturday from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. And the address is on there. So, yeah, and do come up and ask questions. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.